Everyone, welcome to our TopSoil podcast here. TopSoil webinar. This will end up on the podcast, end up on YouTube, all that good stuff. And we host these sessions just to try to bring value and educate all of you, educate ourselves as well, and just keep hosting this conversation and learning here together. So today we've got special guest Hans Riensche on with us. Hans and I have known each other for years. Our dads go way, way back. And Hans has been very involved in a wide array of these different conversation stuff. So that's why we were like, hey, we haven't had a farmer on the podcast for a little while as a guest. We're like, all right, we got to get Hans in here. So real quick intro on Continuum Ag. For those that don't know, obviously we're the host of this. I'm the founder and CEO. We're really helping farmers to manage their data, getting them their CI scores, getting them through CI certification. This is just all about five farmers, four farmers. And again, that's why I was like, all right, let's have Hans come on here. Let's have this conversation because hey, he's got the same type of thought process and mentality to this, but seeing this conversation happen at a global perspective and trying to navigate it locally as well. So, without further ado, let's just jump kind of right in. So, Hans, I'll let you introduce, yourself and talk about your farm and kind of some of your background. But want to talk about your Nuffield Scholar. I think you're kind of right in the middle of the program right now, but still, you've been seeing a lot there, and would love to talk about that and just kind of
Totally.
global. What's going on globally with all this. So maybe let's start about your farm, and then we'll talk globally, and then we'll kind of bring it back to the US and some of these markets and stuff. For everyone that's on, it's Hans and I have known each other for a while and we're buddies. We're just going to kind of, talk about all kinds of different conversations here. I know it's going to go in a lot of different directions. So you all just hop in, ask your questions. Hans has a heck of a perspective on this space as a young guy here too. And that's where it's like, all right, let's have the
Yeah, please bring
conversation.
the question onslaught and we'll do our best to answer all of them.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Hans, thank you for taking the time. We're both probably supposed to be out farming today, but we're not. We're here talking on
we're,
computers.
we're, we're taking a break, but no. First of all, thanks for having me in here.
Yeah,
It's
you
been
bet.
fun. Enjoyed watching these, and we're on our farm. We're trying to do the best we can to actually take the information we're learning and put it into practice. And so it's kind of fun to get to share where we're at, hear where the audience is at, and see what we can do with it.
Yeah.
So name's Hans Riensche, farm up in northeastern Iowa, kind of near Waterloo. Farm with my parents and then my sister and brother-in-law. And so our operation, it's really kind of three farms in a trench coat, but the part of the farm that my wife and I are responsible for is about 1,200 acres of rented, leased, or rented, owned, and custom ground.
Yep.
And corn and soybeans, I know, massively different than the rest of Iowa here, but we are a row crop farm. What we do try to do different though is we're pretty forward leaning on trying to vertically integrate as much of the value chain as we can on our own farm, build commercial drying, storage, our own truck fleet. We've kind of got a small custom spray and fertilizer business on top of what we're doing in our own acres. But we also work with a whole host of different startups in the farm. So at any time, we'll have about a dozen different companies that have got different research plots or trials, trying out a new product, a new idea here and there, because we love bringing in people from outside of farming to take a glance at it because they're going to ask questions that, Mitchell and I might not ask because we've been
Yeah.
doing this for generations, right? So we try to
And
work
you're
with a
talking about
whole
with like
host.
farm visits and stuff, or you're talking about specifically within some of these startups that may not have an ag background?
The best thing is you get maybe a startup that's been founded by someone who's got an ag background and they'll end up hiring a staff that doesn't, or you get people who come from entirely outside of it. So we've got some startups that were brought in by someone who's got engineering background, medical background. They found a technology. There's one I'm working with right now. Most of what they do is proprietary, so I can't talk about it too deep, but it was started by someone who was making hydrogen, and then they accidentally found out a way to make products that are useful to agriculture. And so away we
Awesome.
go working with them, and it came out of the clean energy space. So it's been tremendous, but in amongst those have been working in the carbon space because of some markets we got into. So this is going to be the fifth year where we are actively selling carbon credits.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So I was wondering about that. You guys have been in it for a while and looking at, and I know you've been involved in carbon offsets and insets. Obviously, now we're, exploring CI as well. Maybe let's dig into that 5 years of doing it, like that's quite a while here already. What's
Yeah.
the approach there, or what's like kind of just the thought process of the mentality towards, hey, let's figure out carbon markets?
Well, I'll tie that back into the global. So the US is so quick background on what the Nuffield program is and where
Yeah.
this global experience comes from. So the Nuffield program is a program where young farmers or people in agribusiness can apply to travel to go around the world to different farming operations or agribusinesses and get a better understanding of how they function. And it sticks you in this network of farmers who are trying to push the envelope a little bit. And it's a good way to exchange ideas, to challenge yourself. And one of the things I've been learning about it, I'm going to bring this right back to that carbon market, is that the United States is in one of the most favorable positions when it comes to approaches to the environment and carbon out of all of the major food and ag producing nations in the world. Well, there are so many when there you can go pull on a chart and find someone that yes, so and so is more favorable. But when we're talking about the majors, we have we are able to get paid for conservation land in countries like Brazil, it's mandatory, or in Europe, it's mandatory. From carbon on the sequestration side, we're able to turn that into an opportunity where we get paid to literally improve our own soil. And then you go to places like New Zealand, was just with a peer group of farmers in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago. And the people from New Zealand bringing up, they don't get any credit for their sequestration efforts on the farm. And so my approach is I don't know that this environment is going to always be as favorable as it is today.
Sure.
And if that's the case, we need to be in a position of learning. So we've been in the spot where, hey, when we read the contracts, we know when we've got the ability to break from a market.
Yeah.
And if we've got the ability to break on favorable terms, let's go take a portion of the acres and give it a try. So we started with one carbon vendor in 2019, and we're working with them for a couple of years and then realized there was some value in diversifying. And we tried working a couple different other places. And one of the places we work now is here at Continuum.
Yeah. That's awesome. Um, So that kind of brings me to, I haven't talked with farmers as much here recently, right, about enrolling in different like carbon credit programs. But when a lot of farmers were looking at those contracts, right, a couple of years ago, like when you guys were getting into them too, I was always telling farmers, look at what is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, is the contract going to pay you enough money to make it worth it? Are you basically already going to be kind of doing the practices anyway? And it just kind of fits into your operation. Like you have the equipment, you're going to kind of do this stuff anyway. And this just fits. And then is it with somebody that you trust? And then what is the long term of the contract? And can you get out of it? Because this is the Wild West, it's continuing to change. We don't know who the right long term players are going to be. But if you got to out, then hey, take the money that's on the table and then get it out later. So anyway, those are kind of my rules of thumb that I've developed in this. Is that how you've kind of thought about it too?
That's totally how I thought about it because, it's people like to say things like, oh, it's the Wild West. We don't know what's going on, but some town's going to be a ghost town and someone's going to be Denver. And so it's
Yeah.
like, if you're
Yeah.
not trying to buy real estate in both, what are you doing? Because you never know which one's going to be the one that breaks. But, if you've got a couple of different fields, it's okay to try a little here, a little there, a little here and see because, we read through all the contracts and we knew what we could and couldn't do. Some fields, maybe didn't have to change too much in practice. There was some idiosyncrasies in the data we got back, but
Sure.
we learned that. And now that we've learned it and we've tried some other spots, we're able to actually hone in on what we think is the best opportunity for our farm.
And you think so far, like you haven't gotten burned or is there any horror stories in it so far? It's been like we kind of hedged against that and sitting good and overall pretty positive.
We haven't taken any risks on anything that we weren't willing to lose.
Yeah.
And so, there are some fields that you could call it a burn. We, go to the no-till cover crop system and, yields were more or less the same on our operation, or maybe a slight decline. And then there was no substantial payment for it. And so in that situation, on a field by field case, we've had some losses, but that's okay because we intentionally set up something that was not going to be so big of an experiment that
Sure.
the loss really caught up with us. So
Makes
it's
sense.
about hedging. You don't sell all your corn on one day. You
Yeah.
don't buy all your fertilizer on one day. You got to hedge this too, and then you're going to be just fine.
Yeah. I like that approach. How's that changed? So one of the observations I've got is it's changed from the big focus on carbon offsets, kind of the carbon insets, and now to CI. How have you seen that change here on your own farm, and then maybe speak to that from a global perspective too.
So I would totally agree on the offsets to insets shift. And I would personally make the argument that CI is a continuation of the insets.
Mhm.
And what we're also what we're seeing is that we've got a whole host of companies, namely food companies. You've got the Pepsis, the Unilevers, the Nestle's, are trying to invest upchain into regenerative practices. And they're trying to be able to say, we source XYZ amount of product from acres that are this level of sustainability. And that lets them go make a claim to a consumer because they're seeing that. The second thing that gets kind of left out when you look at markets that are developed by companies that have that mindset that drives us right back to a greater perspective of CI is that many of these companies are based out of the EU. And for any company that's based in the EU, you now suddenly have a whole level of tracking that they're being required to do.
Right.
And if we can help them meet goals to whether it's in deforestation, whether it's in carbon, they're going to pay out for it because they're getting pressured from a government that isn't ours, but the opportunity exists for us here in the US. So we might as well be taking advantage of the situation that they're in because they're willing to pay us to adopt the practices we want to.
And we're seeing some of that with like ADM. I know is paying for like low car or non-deforestation soybeans. I believe paying like 20 cents a bushel for if
Yep.
you can prove that's non-deforested. It's 100% you're right. It's for the European market. So it's these other geopolitical like impact that could impact our bottom line here. And that's, again, why we want to have this conversation today. Be thinking about this from a global perspective. So maybe speak directly to, let's talk about Europe for a little bit and how things happening in Europe are going to be impacting us, maybe already are. We're kind of hitting on it a little bit, but you've got your thumb on that pulse super well. What are you seeing specifically in regards to Europe and their kind of current politics and current focus on all this?
So you've got this huge divide in Europe where, Eastern Europe kind of doesn't care.
Mm.
Poland and countries like that just want to be left alone to farm, but they're kind of dictated by Brussels. And what Brussels is saying is, it's got to be, we've got to put 10% of the cropland into natural reserve. And we got to source stuff that hasn't been deforested since, the magic day being in 2020, as if, it hadn't happened before. But the thing is that this is also going to put some sort of a damper on Brazil's export ability into the EU. And sometimes that gets left off the table. So we were meeting with Viterra here a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about how they're actively trying to source more from the US to meet this. And now, naturally, that means that Brazil is going to export more to China. And I used to work in China, so don't think that there's not an environmental push within that country as well. But the uh, the result we're going to get from this is if the world fractures along geopolitical lines and Brazil becomes closer to China and is more of a supplier to their needs, that means we have to satisfy Europe in order to export. So if we can get paid for it in advance and we can take hold of an opportunity, let's be opportunists about it.
For sure. What else do you think they're going to be kind of pushing for? So we've talked about, carbon, and they got to decarbonize, and they have to report their scope 3 carbon footprint, and their banks are very much involved here. And of course, the whole European Union is what you're referring to with Brussels, right? That they're all saying we all got to kind of do this. We're all being mandated together in this, bureaucratic system. And
Yep.
so they're saying carbon, but like it's nature and non-deforestation, it's other stuff. What do maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so there is a concern among European voters that they've lost so much ground that has been in natural preserves. And there's this seeking right now to add biodiversity back onto acres. And it's very pronounced in some areas and it's very quiet in some other spots. But writ large, what it means is that when we look at something as, common to us as the CRP patch, that's actually got its own marketing story to an exporter. And if you can
Mm,
say, such and such acres are being protected on our farm because I literally can't afford to grow corn on those acres, I lose on the variable costs.
yeah, yeah,
You can turn that into a positive story. Other things that are going to come from Europe, though, is there is a push on water usage, and that's one that's even further out. like there's people who've charted out where these future credit markets or future inset markets are going. And I think that's something that we're going to need to be very conscious of here in the US, because it might change the direction of how our grain flows. That, like, I hate to say it because I'd love to invest in irrigation, but there might be some scrutiny towards irrigated corn ground that is not being handed to non-irrigated. There's going to be
Sure.
a lot of things that go into here about what's the use of fossil water in the long run. And so I think things will continue to get a little tighter on restriction, but at the same time, they keep saying a goal and then they keep delaying it.
Yeah.
And so, some farmers might misread that. Like, even within my own family, I have some debates with dad about, like, oh, this will never happen. It's like it won't happen as fast as they say it will. But when I'm looking at my grandkids and stuff, they'll say, I'm glad we got that figured out by 2031 instead of
Sure.
waiting till 2050.
I'm super bullish on the exact same thing. And I translate it as, okay, right now, the focus is on the carbon outcomes for the most part, right? Most of the money,
Totally.
most of the programs, it's about what are your practices and how does that impact your carbon footprint, your carbon outcome. But definitely see it on the rise, and where it's not just going to be what is your carbon impact, but your water quality impact, your water utilization, your biodiversity and habitat impact, all that kind of stuff. And you point out something that I haven't heard anyone else speak about it in that way of utilizing some of those other conservation practices like the CRP or buffers or whatever it's going to be as a like a
Totally.
proactive kind of tool that we can do that here. And we've utilized this because we have a program that compensates you for not growing corn, but you don't really want to grow a row crop there anyway because you kind of lose money there most for the most part. You lose money there anyway. But leveraging that now as part of this holistic positive story, huge opportunity. But I'm not seeing that really being necessarily done today, though.
It's not. And it's kind of something where they're usually going to see it from a bureaucrat who represents the farmers, and that's fine, but they're not hearing this directly back from us, which is what makes it so important with our trade delegations, that we get you know younger, more proactive people in amongst those groups,
Sure.
because they're going to hear this story. And there's I worked at a market research and business consulting firm for a couple of years before I came back to the farm, and you got to work with a variety of different organizations and their boards. And the ones that had younger people in there, you ended up hearing the farmers who are headed towards retirement. We respect them, we appreciate them, but they're not ready to adopt a whole bunch of different, like, practices right now.
Yeah.
The younger farmers, or people who are in their 50s and are raising a family, they're ready to change and adopt, and they're saying, bring me opportunities, don't bring me safety nets. And when
Well,
you
whether
go
it
for the
be change
opportunities,
practices or
help.
just utilizing that story, I think, and utilizing that data and changing just the way that we're managing data and changing the way we're telling the story. Sometimes it might come with changing the actual practices too, or it's just better
Or just getting rewarded for what
amplifying
you're
what we're
doing,
doing.
right?
Yeah.
And there's plenty we are,
Yeah. Doing
but
that stuff. But yeah, the issue in today's programs, for the most part, whether it be CI or a carbon credit program, is you only factor in what happens on that parcel of ground or in the cultivated acres and stuff, right? The waterways that you use or the grassed buffer strips or terraces, whatever, or the CRP that's on the edge. Like usually none of that's really factored in today, but I don't think it's too far out that it is going to be a whole farm score, probably, right? Like
it
it's got to be
it
factored in the
100%
whole
will be.
operation. Yeah,
And what's interesting is you go to some of these areas where it is tougher to operate, and you look at what some of the farms are doing. They're building entire farm ESG reports, and it's like sometimes those could be toxic letters to think about. But in this case, they're talking about, this is our impact on our environment, our community, and this is how we run ourselves. And all of a sudden they can show, we've got 100 acres of terraces, and we've got 100 acres of pollinator habitat, and that
yeah,
becomes part of their own, like, story. And one of the
sure.
things that is usually is the rebuttal to this is, well, who the hell is going to pay me for it?
That's
And
exactly
that
what I was
is
just
and
gonna
that
say.
and that is that is a very valuable thing.
Yeah,
But we're starting to watch it, and I respect the people who've stuck through it, as there wasn't a market for it, honestly. But
yeah.
now you've got, with the EUDR, now with some of the startups that are coming out and selling these direct contracts to the food companies, it's finally arriving.
Yeah. So by just collecting all of that management data, and being forward thinking with that, like likely going to put you in position to have that pay off at some point here. So yeah, I think that's totally right. It's something I need to think about more because even within our software and stuff, like we're not collecting that stuff today. We're not collecting, is it CRP or, where are your waterways at and your terraces and buffers and like we're not collecting that stuff. But we're probably going to need to at some point here soon. Um, but yeah, and okay, so now let's go back into the Nuffield stuff a little bit. So you're saying, that Nuffield group, it's been around for a long, long time, and if people haven't looked into it, I would definitely encourage that they do. It's something I would love to do at some point, but just haven't been able
Give it a
to
go.
work.
Yeah, it started in the 1940s in the UK and it
Wow.
spread into the US in the early 2010s. And so there's been there's been a handful of scholars from the US, but it's a growing program. I would encourage anyone who's, the rules are you got to be working in agriculture or farming. And I think you got to be under 45. And if you've got something that you just want to go out and learn about, and they have a scholarship that covers most of your travel expenses. Um, yeah, I would say absolutely don't hold back. Applications are due roughly about this time, so I'll have to look and see whether the applications are closed. I should look that up before the call. But even for next year, if you know someone who fits that, let them know. Or if you yourself want to, feel free to reach out to me or any way you can. And yeah, happy to talk about it.
Tell your story through it a little bit more. How did you become aware of it? How did you go about it? Where have you gone so far? What is your do you choose like a project and stuff? Like explain the whole thing a little bit more because I think especially within our audience, like there's probably a lot of people that would make great applicants.
So yeah, I agree. So I learned about it from some other farmers who were actually coming through the US and they stopped by our farm and we had nothing to do with the network at the time. But what you end up doing is you get to pick your own topic. And my topic is on how family farm succession varies around the world.
Hmm.
Because sometimes we think the that 5 or 6 generations is a very old family farm. And it is to an extent. But at the same time, there's farms that have existed for 20 generations in other parts of the world. And so it's I've been traveling to other countries. I've been in Australia, Zimbabwe, the UK, Netherlands, Georgia, Brazil, a whole host of these kinds of countries all across the map,
Hmm.
and getting to talk to them about their localized circumstances and how that impacts their succession planning. Because the lens I'm looking at it is we've got all these short-term sustainability goals, but did we actually sustain the people who are going to achieve these outcomes? Because if I would, let's say I take the best care of this soil and I check all the right boxes, and then I retire. My kids want nothing to do with farming. They sell the ground, it goes to the highest bidder, and they just rip all that back up. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's not necessarily achieving the long-term value that people want it to, and it's not taking care of the families and giving them the space on there. So I care a lot
Sure.
about that. So that's what I've been studying, and that's where what's been on the road, what I've been on
That's
the road
awesome.
for.
Yeah, I think all of that, right, boils down to if you're going to be long-term sustainable, it's got to be economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable. There's a human component to that as well, right? You got to be able to kind of what the rules of engagement and stuff, like you got to be able to stay within that. So that's super interesting. What do you any hot takes and things that you've learned so far with that or things that you're thinking about trying to like implement already?
So some of the most interesting observations from it has been um, just how favorable some other parts of the world's laws are towards
Okay.
farm transition.
Yeah.
If you take a country like Ireland, for example, if you transition the farm to the next generation before that next generation has turned 35, there's no capital gains tax. And so what the objective is, Ireland is on the verge of just being completely dependent on food imports, and they want to be more secure themselves. And by bringing in, the next generation, no harm, no foul meant to the older generation. They're the people who have 40 years for an investment to pay off. And so
Sure.
they're upgrading, they're building. So it's interesting to see how there are laws in place in other parts of the world that maybe we could mirror that might help bring more young people into farming or help bring different people perspectives into the same operation faster.
So there's no capital gains if that young person bought whatever that operation, but they or no capital gains if they pass it off. So the person that's selling it doesn't have capital gains if they sell it to a young person. That's what it is. And then the young
Exactly.
person, they see it as, hey, I'm young, I've got a long time to be able to actually make this investment pay off because it's going to be expensive. They're not necessarily
Totally.
compensated for that, but maybe they roundabout get a better deal because the seller doesn't have capital gains tax. So they don't have to factor that in. They're going to retain the upside of their sell. But that younger person gets a little bit better deal, but trying to make the flywheel spin faster by getting more access to those younger farmers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you go to places that are the exact opposite. Like if you go to Zimbabwe, there there are no formal laws that allow you to own farmland. And so if someone wants to, take a corner of your field and put up a house and live there, there's nothing that stops them. And so you watch these businesses have to sustain themselves in a spot where nothing can be taken for granted, that you have to you have to be forward thinking, and a lot of them are thriving. There's a lot of thriving businesses there, and there's a
Wow.
lot of growing business, especially as they can export fruits and vegetables into Europe and Asia. And there's a growing blueberry industry, snap pea industry, um, even in spite of the things that are challenges. But honestly, a lot of that inspires me to try and be more creative on our farm, because I'm like, gosh, we're boring. If we've got, crop insurance and, corn and soybeans, like how much more creative can we get? And that's
Sure.
part of the reason why we dive into so many different outside firms to bring in ideas and run trials and do stuff on our farm.
Well, I think, in the US, obviously we're just so established in a lot of these laws and rules and regulations and systems that it kind of keeps you in the box here too. Where like, yeah, if in Zimbabwe where they don't have anything, like it's all
There's no box to be in.
there's no
And
box at all. There's no box to play within at all. That's
and
crazy.
it allows a level of creativity that, I feel like Continuum tries to push. I feel like we
Yeah,
try to push. I feel like the
sure.
people who are on this call try to push. But it's really nice to actually get to see that that's welcomed in other parts of the world.
Well, I think my approach so far has been okay, as the young guy going back to the farm, I can help to bring, I can't necessarily bring all the capital, right? And we're not ready to actually do a farm transition and stuff. And I'm not ready for it. I don't necessarily want it. Trying to do other stuff here
Mhm.
too. But I can bring ideas, I can bring technology, I can bring these sustainability opportunities to the farm and help to contribute that as a new revenue stream or new value add to the operation. I think that's been pretty similar to what you've been doing in your operation here as your way to directly add new value to the farm too, right? Kind of moving out
Absolutely.
that piece of creativity that you were just getting at.
Well, yeah, because you and I've talked about this before, but so in our operation, my parents have the lion's share of the land base. And
Yeah,
so it's like if I come back in and, my wife and I have been working to grow our part of the business, but before it was enough to sustain ourselves, we worked out a deal with mom and dad, said, hey, I'll create value on those acres that you would have not had otherwise, but I also wouldn't have had the value if you didn't have the land base. And
sure.
so we cut an equitable deal that we saw fit us, that said, here's the portion you're going to get because you created this value out of thin air, or out of just, out of these programs that exist and these markets that exist. And both sides are winning, and it creates value for us that we can use to feed our part of the family. And it didn't take away from the larger business as a whole,
Yeah.
while still creating space for us. Versus if dad would just say, hey, I'm just going to stop renting this and start renting to you, now suddenly his part of the operation is going to suffer the amount that we gain.
Sure, sure. Yeah, his costs and stuff, some of his fixed costs aren't going to be able to be spread across all that. He
Absolutely.
needs to keep his business going. But yeah, you were doing it's a sharecropping arrangement basically, but you're not sharing in the actual crop itself. You're
Yeah.
sharing in this new crop, this new value add, and doing a sharecropping arrangement.
Coin
So
it, the
yeah,
share
pretty
cover
unique.
crop, share carbon crop
Yeah,
deal,
yeah. That's smart. It's an awesome idea, and yeah, to be able to have the land that isn't ready to be transitioned yet, but hey, we can still start creating new value for both parties, and you can start building up some hopefully some cash and some assets that then when the transition is ready, you're actually in a financially feasible position that you can actually make it work.
And that's something that, I talk about with other friends. I've got other good friends who, they're doing the exact same thing now. And it's something that we've seen, it's easy to take an N of one and assume, say like, hey, this worked for him, it'll work for everybody. But it's one of those things where it really has been working for a whole host
Yeah,
of other people. And, as long as your family's got the mindset that you're in the position that you want this business to go on, it's one really good way to get it there.
sure.
So yeah, we
Well, it's
love
just
it.
creating that new niche you can bring to the table, right? Down in my neck of the woods, a lot of the young guys, they come in and say, "Hey, I'll help to put up the capital and build a hog barn on a chunk of the land," right? So dad still
Totally.
owns the land, but then the young guy can go in there and put up the capital and do the work and stuff and organize putting in the hog barn and start being able to create some new value that way that then puts them in a position where they can buy the rest of the land at a future time. So similar type of concept, but just doing it in a manner that doesn't cost $1 million. So either of or more by putting in
Yeah.
some big infrastructure.
And much like the hog barn, if it's gonna be yours and you do the work, it's one of those things where, in our family, even my brother-in-law, who's only a couple years older than me, he
Yeah.
doesn't want to do the research on these sorts of things, the insets. He doesn't really want to
Sure.
do the digging into the EUDR. It's not that he's opposed to it, or not that he couldn't. It's just he would rather have someone else do it. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
it's in one of those spots where it also can mend like all these new programs that roll out. I keep track of them for the family, and I also share that with a list of close friends. And so, as these new market opportunities roll out, we've got our valuable partners, but then also, it's a good chance as a young person to be a representative for kind of a block in a way.
Well, I mean, everyone in an operation, like you guys is not everyone needs to be wearing every hat. Like you can actually pick and choose and actually have some organizational structure to it where certain people should be focusing on their place of best fit and each individual can really dig into the things that they really enjoy and that they want to do and that brings value. But
And
are
I
you,
would say that goes down to two people working together. You can go all the
yeah,
way down. You don't have to have any scale to do that.
yeah, no,
But you
for
were going to
sure.
ask something.
No, I was gonna say, have you seen any parallels to that in some of your like Nuffield travels? Like any similar type of scenario that you've seen on some of the farms you've been on so far?
So I've seen some of that, specifically where and a lot of it has to pertain to some of these same markets, some of these
Yeah.
emerging environmental markets. I've got young farmers in Brazil who are um, spearheading it for their families, and then you've got some farmers in Australia that they do a ton of land improvement in Australia in order to actually make any of it productive in
Mm.
some states. And the younger people lead that, and it's really been valuable for both generations or all three for them to be leading it. So it is something that you do see in some other spots, and it's kind of comforting to know, like, hey, we haven't just thought of, I love getting to think about having an idea for the first time, but I know with 8 billion people, there's a very slim chance that you do. And so it's like, hey, it's good that if this crowd is the crowd that we like to benchmark ourselves against, is at that same, point in their mind, that's a good thing for us.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Um, and yeah, so last kind of piece on this, um, do you still have a whole bunch of these like travel and stuff to do for Nuffield?
Yeah, so they give you a scholarship, and that scholarship has got a couple of funders. And for me, it's Iowa Soy, it's the People's Company, it's the Farm Bureau, and it's the pork producers, and
Okay.
appreciate their
So you're
support.
able to
But
go and
then
kind of get some of your own sponsors and stuff to match like what they.
totally.
Oh, cool.
So you can go on and pursue more sponsors too. So if you've got a project that pertains to them, that's fantastic. But then you've got this great network of support here in Iowa. But then you are able to just go until you run out of that scholarship amount. And I personally am investing on my own behalf as well into some of this because of the stuff that I'm learning actually just being so applicable and challenging the way that
Sure.
we do our business here as well. So yeah, there's no limit. I still have a ton more travel yet to be on the road for. And it's fun to actually, you hear about an idea as you're reading somewhere or talking to staff at somewhere like Continuum, and then to actually just turn around and go see it in
Go check it
practice.
out.
And then, yeah, versus versus just only hearing about it. The second nice thing, the hidden benefit is like there are a lot of people who also want to come to the US. And so for the month of August around the Farm Progress show, I was probably hosting someone every couple of days,
Yeah,
but that's someone who's bringing a new idea into the farm. They're looking at it, asking us, why do you do this and not that? And it's another farmer from another part of the world. And they're just as valuable to me as the people who've got these startups and bringing in new ideas. So
100%.
that's fun. And as long as it's August for a crop farm, that's an okay time of year to be on out
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
So
yeah. Then it's great, and you're just kind of hanging out, waiting for harvest to start anyway. But yeah, no, we've hosted a bunch of different Nuffield scholars as well. That's part of where I got connected in with the program. We've hosted a bunch of them. I just hosted one of your fellow classmates from Brazil probably a month or ago or so here now.
yep.
And yeah, it's like you go to one farm and then you end up connecting them to the next, to the next, to the next. It just kind of snowballs, it seems. And you start with somewhat of a plan and it ends up just, you never know what's really going to happen. But yeah, that guy was from Brazil. And we were talking about like, especially the biofuel markets and stuff down there was really interesting. Just last week, we had a group on our farm from Italy. Here in next weekend, I'll have guys coming in from Japan. Like, just fun to be able to
Wonderful.
yeah, see these different groups. Now, like the Japan guys stuff, I'll put in a plug for Global Farmer Network, which kind of works. It's not the same as Nuffield, but they're kind of buddies and they kind of do some cross collaborating and stuff, and a lot of overlap and participation between the two programs. But that Global Farmer Network is something I've been able to tap into. It was just a 1 week abroad, and then tap into this global network. It doesn't have all the rest of the travel stuff. You could get more there, but that's not the main focus of it, like with Nuffield. But
And the nice thing about it, I've always said it is, if you get the chance to go over and see a farmer in Europe, you're for 8 hours on a plane and a ticket, you bought a time machine,
yeah,
and it's you get to go ahead 30 years because everything that gets passed in regulation there drifts its way on over to Canada and slowly makes its way on over to us with a stop in Australia in between. And so when it comes to actually meeting these markets or seeing what CI is going to be worth to us, like those are people who I benchmark us against. So I'm constantly in touch with farmers in, New Zealand or the Netherlands where the carbon intensity of their products, sure, it's going to be measured in, tons of CO2 per ton of product created. So, I can do some quick math and get it down to bushels, but yeah, I'm getting to see exactly what mechanisms they're using in order to be, held responsible against. And in some of those places, it's like it's something that you get to think forward about your own operation. And I think that another thing that comes out of those conversations with those other farmers is when I mention it is good in the US, I seriously mean it because what we what sticks in my mind is we currently have an opportunity to get paid to literally improve our soil. In somewhere like New Zealand, where they're not giving credit for the sequestration being done in their soil, what's happened is the corporations have become responsible for offsetting their own carbon emissions. And they're not as creative as farmers and they're not as skilled as farmers. And so what ends up happening is people begin planting plantations of forests in the hopes that it's going to sequester carbon. And one of the farmers from New Zealand was just talking about how the forests have higher levels of soil erosion, and the trees break loose and they damage the towns. In Scotland, I was at a farm where the same thing had happened. The neighbor property had been bought and planted to forestry, and the trouble is that now there's no one on that farm.
yeah,
The kids aren't going to the local school. They're not paying the local taxes. They're not keeping the grocery store up. And so the fact, I think there's kind of almost a dire message in this that if we take hold of these opportunities, it's going to be a boon to our communities as well, because the money is actually going into the hands of the farmers like ourselves versus having it slip out and then it goes, somewhere else. And,
yeah,
they're operating under their own constraints. So I don't want to sit here and fault them, but their system is faulting them. And our
yeah.
system is helping us. So we really need to take hold of these chances to do it, because if we're already running with it, they'll feel no need to build those kinds of systems here in place of what we got
That's
now.
a really good point. Yeah. So for the companies that like they don't have to come in and buy the land themselves, like a Bill, obviously Bill Gates comes to mind, right, of being kind of accused of that. Like he's got a carbon footprint, he's got to offset, so he's just going to buy the land himself and do it on his own ground versus work within a system like you're referring to, that we could be part of the solution. He can do his own thing. He doesn't need to try to be a farmer and try to own a bunch of farm ground. Instead, the system could be set up to actually share in that together. The other parallel there being, because of the systems we got set up, taking land out of production for other purposes, like solar farms and wind farms and stuff like that. Very similar parallel where that land could have been passed on to a young farmer who was going to farm it regeneratively and actually sequester carbon and do a lot of good with it. And instead, now it's out of farming and likely will be basically forever. And that young person who is in that rural community and whose kids want to go to school in that rural community now, that money's going to the big city. And one person got paid really well. Good for them. Don't fault them at all. It's the system that they're in. But yeah, the ripple effect that these kind of decisions can have for having a system set up or lack thereof, like we got to be thinking about this stuff now. And great that you're learning about all that, right? And seeing where this puck is going to go in the future.
And I'm a little too free market to tell someone what exactly to do with their land, but I'm also free
Yeah.
market enough to say that we currently have a growing carbon market, be it CI, we can, if we just aggregate it all into one, that it's like, if we can let the free market, which means us as providers, solve for the carbon issues and solve for the environmental issues of these other companies, that's a very good thing, because that market will only be growingly transparent. Like I think growingly is a new word I just made up, but
Yeah.
so it's only going to get more transparent over time,
Yeah, for sure.
and that is going to be one of those things where you look at it and you say, what's the price of corn and what's the price of carbon when we wake up in the
Yeah.
morning? And
Yeah.
it's, it might be 2040 before we get there, but then, this is just like, if you ever play a sport, this is practice. Like here, the next couple of years, this is the practice round. And then the
Yeah.
game's going to start probably about 2030 when all these commitments lock in from major corporations. And so there's even a level to which that there's speculation that they're not buying at the levels that they should yet, because then it still gives them room to grow.
Sure.
And heard that from a couple different communities when I was working in Intel. And that's fair, but that means that if we're practicing now, it means that we're going to show up even better for the game when it really
Yeah.
starts.
No, I think that's exactly right. And it might be getting sped up now, at least in the CI space, right? In the US, in the biofuel piece being sped up because of this
Yep.
regulation coming in a sector here. But yeah, it's going to start kind of forcing the hand of some of these companies and stuff and forcing some of this to accelerate faster. But I think that's great insight of looking forward to, like, these companies, they're going to have to start meeting some of these goals, or saying, they're going to pivot, right? Which some of them do, but a lot of these groups, like, they're not going to be able to just throw their hands up saying, no, we're not going to do anything. Like, they're going to be forced in an ongoing manner to pivot and figure it out. And we better make sure that our systems are in place for us to be able to raise our hand saying, hey, we're still here and we can still be a part of your solution. Like, you're trying these other things and they're not really working. Well, hey, this proven concept is still here. We've been practicing it. We've been scaling it up. We've been building systems. Now we're ready to be part of your solution. So
Totally. And
I think that's a
and
great
so
insight.
and that's something where, even when we were working with a prior vendor that we're working with less, and the payments weren't exactly sublime, it still was enough for us to start paying off the stuff that we needed in order to have automatic uploads,
Mm,
right from all of our planters and combines and stuff. So all of our records were automatic. And the nice thing about that for us in the long run is when we go to turn in records for the carbon market, it's just click a couple buttons. Yeah, you got to sort through and sift through some data, but we're not here chasing down bills and chasing down invoices. And so, we're going to take our smaller wins and reinvest them. We've got a big belief in taking whatever we make in this market, reinvesting it into getting more back out of the market.
sure.
And it's, going to get us set up in the spot where we can be a high validity provider, because at some point, I do think the market is going to separate and there's going to be kind of higher and lower validity credits. And I think that there's going to be this incredibly important inflection point that if you can demonstrate that your stuff is rock solid,
Yeah.
that you're going to be better off than someone who's kind of like, yeah, I got some chicken scratch here. And now is our moment to get the money to do
Yeah.
that.
So you're thinking that this whole idea that Continuum's got of this proactive verification of the on-farm practices and CIs, maybe we're onto something there. Is Maybe
If
I'm
if you want
selectively
that as a
hearing you
marketing
less.
pitch, you take it. But I do think there is something there, and it's something
Uh,
that I'm betting on with our farm at
I
this
think you're
moment.
spot on, right? It is there's a certain approach where it's, hey, fill out this little survey, we'll pay you a small amount, and if you get audited and found to be fraudulent, we didn't really pay you anything, so it's small peanuts, right? Like, yeah, we're gonna win some, we're gonna lose some, but we're doing it with a small enough, payment and big enough scale that it kind of is a wash in the end versus this separation of no, we're gonna go super solid, high value, high financial amount, and we're going to be combative to the scrutiny and make sure that we can pass through by having the data there and being able to make sure that this can be legit. I for sure am seeing that. Obviously, I'm very bullish on that just within CI and the opportunity that's arising now. That if you want a bigger percentage, if you want a bigger cut, if you want to be paid more, it's all based on the validity of the data because the companies up this, or I guess it's down the supply chain, companies, they've got to be reporting this, and the better the data that they have, the less scrutiny that they have to take on, the more they're willing to pass back because it's less fraud, fraud avoidance, risk avoidance, less risk of being called out for greenwashing or being
Totally.
investigated or having somebody come and throw stones at them. So
And
yeah.
like there, and at some point it's due to happen because I mean let's take the trouble that happened with rainforest credits here a year or two ago, and it was this massive outcry of kind of the recognition that most that so many of them were false. And the what we don't want to end up having is if we never got our ducks in a row on our data, there will, I hate to say it, there probably will be some bad actors in this space.
100%.
And as long as you can differentiate yourself from the people who walk in as bad actors, you're going to be okay. But if your level of validity is the same level of their validity, it's not going to help you. And so the trouble that comes with this is it can turn into a part-time job to make this happen. But when you start adding up the dollars of, let's say that you can create $10 an acre for yourself, or let's say you can add 10 cents a bushel to your soybeans with, one deforestation program or 15 or 20 of the next, like you're in the spot where those are not unrewarded hours of investment.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a livestock farmer who's laughing at me here saying, well, with what time? But like
Yeah.
it is worth the time that you do eventually carve out for it.
But it is, yeah, that I mean, at the beginning, it might have to be kind of with your own time, or you contract with some type of a group. And obviously, that's where we're trying to fill some of that. But over time, like I'm seeing a lot of guys saying, hey, if they've got an agronomy company, maybe this is going to open up an opportunity to create some margin, be able to hire a new person that can be dedicated to this, or, for certain size of farming operations, being able to open up new margin, new opportunity that it warrants being able to have a person in there that manages this maybe amongst other things, but it allows you to actually expand your business because you're expanding the revenue streams that you're tapping into. Um, Folks, definitely put in some more questions up too. I want to tie this into this Dr. AKM. I sent you a note or two. Email me for some of the specifics, but I don't know a lot about his situation. But he's asking about what about low carbon coffee, beef? How do we prepare kind of for this? And the real answer is I don't know exactly how to do it today. We can't run a CI score on coffee or beef here today. But more so, Hans, we were just kind of talking about the concepts here, and that's really what I wanted to hit on with this. What's your take on this going beyond corn, soybeans, and how should folks that are, not necessarily sitting here for 45Z, how should they be thinking about preparing for these opportunities going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, um, I'm glad to take it outside of corn and soybeans because um, when you look at EUDR, we always talk about that from a soybean perspective here in the US.
Yeah.
That is across a whole spectrum of different commodities. It will be corn next year for the US, but in the coffee space, we've had this kind of disparate amount of different um, all these different certifications you can get, and some of them are standard like GAP, and then some of them are Rainforest Alliance and they're recognized. But there is a level to which a market like that is controlled by so many smallholders, it's hard to track. But don't think Cargill's not trying. So a good friend of mine actually was a cocoa sourcer for Cargill, and she would be constantly working in West Africa to source cocoa. And you'd be hard pressed to think that they're not going to come up with the same baseline models like they did for GREET,
Sure.
for biofuels for those same things. And it's all going to come down to kilograms of carbon or pounds per unit of output.
Yep.
And so, I mean, they're going to sometime here as they make their way out of the, easy and big markets like corn and soy and wheat, and they're gonna start just measuring every input that goes on and I would make the argument that as a farmer, as a business person, you should be measuring that stuff anyway to know your actual deep down costs. And so I look at the price of
Sure.
the corn today and it's gone up, and I know whether that's actually is profitable or not. And so
Yeah.
the data that you collect on this has got multiple levels of applicability. And even if you're in those other commodities, it's gonna be make sure you've got your granular data that
Yeah.
you know how much urea you put on or something, and you're going to be able to meet these markets as they come out.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think about. Like, let's take the beef side. If we
Yeah.
produce this much low CI corn to feed into an ethanol plant, that also means you're producing a hecking ton of um, low CI DDGs. And where
Yeah.
is that going to go? And if you can track that back to the supply chain, I've got a friend who runs a dairy farm in Kansas, and he's talking about having he's decreasing the carbon intensity of the silage that goes into to feed their cattle. And it's like there it will extend out. And then also keep in mind that many of the companies that operate, those businesses like Smithfield or JS are foreign based. And if their governments push that, it's going to come down the supply chain and be an opportunity for us. And so we're happy to have their investment making our lives more profitable.
For sure.
So we might as well gear up to take it.
I think that's spot on. That was going to be my answer too. Like, hey, we can't, at least Continuum can't run a CI score for coffee or beef today. We're only doing it today for corn, soybeans. We could manually do it for sorghum and rice as well, but you can still manage the same data, collect the same data, and eventually the calculator will be there. So if you're managing the data today, keeping good records about your fertilizer and your other practices, your inputs, keep good records here today, however you can. And our software could be utilized for some of that. But keep the records here today. Then when the scoring calculators become available, then you're sitting there with the data, you're ready to go, plug that into the calculator and spit out a score. I definitely think it'll be the at least it'll be the US livestock industry. I think will be kind of some of the next ones to occur after this biofuel piece. That the next one really
Absolutely.
going to be influenced are the animals. And you had mentioned, the a lot of the meat packers and some of the next folks in the supply chain, they are, a lot of them are foreign and they're going to be pushed on some of these regulations. But I think a lot of it is going to be the financial sector pushing on them, the investors, their banks, the financial sector, and those, whether they are domestic or foreign, they are very much being pressured to figure this out. And they are the ones that are financing and enabling these companies to do what they're doing. So they're very much being pressured to change and enable their supply chain or enable their portfolio to decarbonize. I think that's where, in my mind, the ripple effect really comes from. And then they can look at, they can look at the this biofuel market as something they can kind of mimic and work off of. But
I was just having this conversation with a particular lender of mine, and they were explaining how when they do their European audits, that over 90% of their carbon um, release in the business comes from their clients. And in scope three, that's counted. And so it's one of the it's I've got multiple people who are coming in taking carbon intensities right now on products from our farm,
yeah,
that aren't even being used in the biofuel space because it's going to quickly start offering us differential financing. And I'm glad you brought up finance because one of the debates I end up having frequently is, but the outcome of the election. And we need to think about this in more than 4 years. We need to think about this over a 20-year period.
yeah,
And you know what? This even if all of this gets delayed and we get paid for carbon years after we expected by 2040, by 2050, this is going to be table stakes.
yeah,
And it's one of those things where we can't be sitting on defense waiting for every individual vendor we have to roll out their plan for us because by that moment there all of the opportunity to take advantage of an unsaturated market is going to be gone for farmers, which is why we try to be proactive. It's why we work with groups like Continuum,
yeah,
is because it allows us to get into this market before it's saturated. Because let's say we find a way to add $10 of profitability to the land. What's going to happen? Well, we farm in a competitive neighborhood. We've got some very respectful but strong competition here. Rents could go up $10.
For
And
sure.
so if we can get in ahead of this, we can actually capture that. And someone's going to argue that, well, then why even do it if it's just gonna cause your rent to go up? Well, the reality is rent's going to go up anyway
Yeah.
because I know what neighbors are also taking advantage of these opportunities, and more power to them. They're going to be more competitive. And if we want to stay competitive, then we have to keep our game up and going. And being proactive is the only way to do that.
That's so spot on. Like in whether it be with CI, right? There's a set, like in the biofuel deal, there's a set demand because there's only so much grain that can go into biofuels. And today, the supply of these certificates is low. Therefore, the value that can be passed along to the early movers and shakers is going to be higher. But over time, as you get more supply and the demand stays the same, then the value that it's passed along is going to be less and less and deteriorate over time. So yeah, make hay while the sun's shining. It's all going to lead to more inflation across everything. That's what all these
Perfect.
things do. All of these things lead to cost of everything, inflation going up. That's the way of the world, and we're not going to change that. So you have to figure out how to, like I said, make hay while the sun's shining, play within it. And part of this also my mind went to, we don't want to end up like New Zealand where it's just you're just regulated into it and you get nothing. You just have to do it. You get no financial value out of it. It's just part of the deal. Like that's the alternative here. If we don't go
Yeah.
after this and be proactive in it the right way and tell our story and allow for like market dynamics to actually make this work out, the inverse is you're forced into it and paid nothing. And that also, is going to influence those local dynamics of only certain farms are going to be able to abide within that and play within those rules. And it causes more consolidation over time as well. Just in a really not fun manner.
That risk is totally there, which is why I encourage absolutely anybody to just go out and start working on this because
Yeah.
we don't want to see our local communities have less people in them. We want
Uh,
everyone to be able to take advantage of this, and that's something that I think the door's open to. So I don't. That's why I'm so vocal about it. But
This has been
yeah,
fun to dig in. And there's another question here too about what's going to influence your CI. You can actually get your CI score for free at topsoil.ag, and we have a tool on there that you can calculate what your score would be based on change of practice. But for most farms, the biggest thing that is going to improve your score is using cover crops, reducing tillage, utilizing manure, reducing synthetic fertilizer. It's those type of things. But you can go to topsoil.ag and see that for your own farm. Actually, that happens to be my slide here. So yeah, as we get wrapped up, we're talking obviously big global perspective and stuff here, but this whole conversation boiled down to keep good records, manage good data, and likely reinvest in making sure that you can get even better, cleaner, more accurate records. That's what's going to separate you over the long haul here. Make hay while the sun's shining, but go and gather that. We can't solve all of those problems there by any means. You got to have good equipment or good technology in your equipment, but we can at least help to get the data accumulated and pull it together in a manner where you own it as well. I think that's another key thing we didn't really hit on is farmers, you need to own this data, make sure that it doesn't end up in the hands of the wrong actors and stuff. And to wrap here, we have another webinar coming up November 6th. I mentioned Global Farmer Network. We've got Mary coming on. She is, I don't know if her title is Director of Global Farmer Network or CEO, but we'll talk about kind of this being proactive with our farmer message, with our story. I'll have this conversation with Mary here coming up. We'll email out some material about it as well. And more chit chats every Tuesday, of course. This and all of our material ends up on our YouTube page, but Hans, any final parting stuff? There's been a lot of fun. I knew we were going to get into a lot of different topics. Hopefully, people thought it was insightful. I definitely did, but it is. I mean, to your point, like we're just at the very starting gates here of all this stuff right now. Like this is where the world is going, and we need to be ready for it and capitalize on it.
no, I appreciate the time, and yeah, my only parting comments are we're in the practice rounds right now, and like there is time you're not behind the ball not if you're in the United States right now, to take advantage of this. And so there's plenty of good resources out there, and there's plenty of opportunity to create value from it. And anyone who's already on this webinar is probably ahead of the curve. And I commend you for taking the time out of your day to be researching it, because in the future, this is just going to be, we're going to laugh at this conversation and say, gosh, that's so much a part of, every day. I can't believe back when it was new. So, so it's been great to be on here, and look forward to talking to you all soon.
Fun stuff. Appreciate the time, Hans. Thanks everyone for being on. We'll see you next time.